Israel on the brink of a ground assault on Gaza, the safety of Jews in the UK, and the right to protest or the glorification of terrorism. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Labour's Darren Jones, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, The Observer's Chief Leader Writer Sonia Soda, and Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, Matthew Goodwin. On today's programme.
I'm here because I know that the Jewish community right now is feeling under an enormous amount of pressure given everything that's going on.
The Prime Minister visits a Jewish school in a sign of solidarity with British Jews. In Gaza, residents flee in fear ahead of an Israeli ground offensive. And as the death toll mounts, pro-Palestinian protests are staged across the UK. And last night, here in Westminster, a show of support for Israel too. And in England and Wales, amidst a shortage of prison places, should some lower-level offenders be spared jail? Let's start with the crisis unfolding in Israel, showing you here a map of Israel and the Gaza Strip there on the left-hand side. Along the coast, you can see, following warnings from Israel, from the military and the government, that tens of thousands, or up to 1 million, I think, Gazan citizens have moved southwards, as you can see on that map, towards what's called the Rafah crossing, a crossing that leads out of Gaza and into Egypt. It remains closed at the moment, but that is where many Palestinian citizens are gathering. You can see here, waiting either for the crossing to be opened by Egypt, who at the moment are insisting it does remain closed, but there is diplomacy going on behind the scenes, and also to allow humanitarian aid into southern Gaza ahead of the incursion that the Israelis have warned citizens about, but has yet to start. When talking about this situation, obviously politicians have been asked across the political spectrum, the two main parties, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who was in Israel a few days ago, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, for their response. Let's have a listen.
Israel does have the right to defend itself and protect itself from terrorist attacks from Hamas coming out of Gaza. And does that mean... They do have a duty to minimise civilian casualties, and I've raised this in every conversation I've had with the Israeli government about this issue.
Of course Israel has the right to deal with that terrorism, to go and get those hostages, and to degrade the rockets and military equipment that's being used against them.
So you support the order?
However, it is hugely important that that is within international law.
So the two main parties there. My question to the panel is, will the political consensus demonstrated, outlined by both those politicians hold? Darren Jones.
Yes, I think so, and I hope so, because what we're all calling for is that interventions that are having to take place now are done within international law, and if that is the case, then I suspect there will be a consensus that continues about the right for these actions to take place. Right,
and when you say within international law, the question that has been raised is whether there is a sense of innocent civilians, of Palestinians being made responsible in some way for the Hamas atrocities on southern Israel.
Well, I don't know about that in terms of the reality on the ground, but certainly from our perspective here in Westminster, we should not be conflating innocent Palestinian civilians with Hamas terrorists, and that's why we've said that humanitarian aid needs to be able to make its way into those areas so people can be supported during these awful events.
The consensus is that Israel has a right to defend itself, that it does have a right to go in and hunt out or root out Hamas in Gaza, but they are often embedded in civilian areas or civilian infrastructure. Do you think that political consensus will hold, Catherine?
I mean, it's distressing and shocking what's going on. And I think we have to draw the distinction between Hamas, a group that has perpetrated terrorist acts, 1,300 Jewish people killed. They're also taking hostages and withdrawing back into a territory, using innocent women, children, grandmothers, Holocaust survivors to try and protect themselves. They are using the Palestinian people, who I draw a massive distinction with, as, you know, almost shields. You know, they're using hospitals and other civilian infrastructure to launch military rocket attacks. You know, you need to call on Hamas to not damage the Palestinian people, as well as support Israel's right to defend itself.
Is it going to hold the political consensus between the two main parties?
I think it will, but I think there's a chance it comes under more strain as the reality of Israel's response, I suppose, starts to unfold. And I think everyone's on the same page in terms of saying that Israel's response must be within international law and must be proportionate. But what does proportionate mean? The principle of proportionality in international law means it's absolutely, you must not target the lives of innocent Palestinians. Collective punishment is never OK. But when it comes to a legitimate military objective, like taking out Hamas and degrading the weapons that they are using, as David Lammy said, what is proportionate in achieving that in terms of the unintended consequences? You know, there will be different people in our politics with different views on that. So I expect that the consensus will hold, but there may be differences of opinion on those things.
Matt Goodwin?
Well, I think Israel is probably the only country in the world that we apply this notion of proportionality to, and we fall over ourselves trying to have a very nuanced and specific debate that's acknowledging the wider context and 50 years of geopolitical tensions. The bottom line is Israel has every right to defend itself. It has every right to be blunt, in my view, whatever it needs to do in order to secure the safety of its own citizens. We are only a week on from the atrocities, and I think many British Jews are sat at home watching this debate, feeling very uncomfortable about this debate because we apply a double standard to Israel. These terrorists, Hamas terrorists, are trying to kill Jews because they're Jews. That's the end of the story. Israel, right now, in my view, can do and should do whatever it needs to do to defend its people.
Right. Well, let's just take a look at a couple of headlines, because that is looking ahead to what the two of you have been discussing. War in the Middle East, says The Sun. Fury and fear. Israel Prime Minister vowed to blitz monsters. It says Hamas block Gaza escape routes because we understand that Hamas have actually instructed citizens to stay put, despite warnings from Israel for Gazans to either try and leave or certainly move to the south of the Gaza Strip. If we have a look at the headlines here in the Mirror, this is about fears of an escalation. Middle East on brink. Israel is facing fight on three fronts. That's also referring to what is going on in the north of the country on the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah militia group is amassing there. We understand UN plea to end hell of innocence. That is talking about Palestinians, many of whom have already lost their lives. Fear of an all-out war. Is this where it goes, Darren Jones?
I mean, you have to hope not, right? I mean, nobody wants there to be all-out war in the Middle East, or certainly nobody around this table wants there to be all-out war in the Middle East, and we all want to get to a position of peace as quickly as possible. And the way that happens is for Hamas to stop attacking Israel and to release the hostages so that we can get into that process.
Right. Catherine? I mean, is there a way of pulling back from this situation?
I think it's more about hope. I think it's about the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary working with international partners. We've had King Abdullah of Jordan in number 10 this week. There's intense diplomatic efforts across the piece to talk to all of the brokers in the Middle East and try to avoid this terrible event spreading to something that damages innocent civilians more broadly. So I don't think we should just hope. We should continue to act like we have been doing.
All right. Well, the Jewish community, as Matt Goodwin said, are feeling concern and fear. Schools, some of them, have closed. We can show you some pictures of the vigil again. You saw there in the headlines yesterday in Westminster, a vigil for the victims massacred by Hamas in the southern part of the country. A huge amounts of upset, the Israeli flag being flown there. Let's talk to Mark Gardner from the Community Security Trust, which is a charity that protects British Jews from anti-Semitism and related threats. Welcome to you, Mark Gardner. I mean, how nervous does the Jewish community feel in your mind?
think the Jewish community is more tense than, in my experience, and I've been doing this work for over 30 years. This is a generational challenge now. This is something completely unprecedented in modern times. It's the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. And, you know, even in your opening remarks here, you were unable to call it terrorism. You literally said the Hamas on Israel. And we're talking here about Israel. Does it have the right to defend itself? In Israel, they're calling this the war of no option. So I'm not here to represent Israel or the Israeli government. I'm here to represent British Jews, and British Jews know what is going on here. This is not just another cycle of Middle East conflict, bad though all of that was. This is a war being fought for an unprecedented reason, and where that will lead and the impact that it will have on anti-Semitism here in the UK is something that the community is very nervous about indeed.
And there's been a rise, a dramatic rise, I understand, in anti-Semitic incidents, according to the police. But you advised, I think, Jewish schools to remain open, despite some of them closing. Why was that?
Well, we have a very sophisticated system here at CSC of research, seeing what people are saying. And Hamas put out a call for a day of rage on Friday of last week, which is what actually tipped only 3 out of over 200 Jewish schools in the UK over the edge into closing their doors. We knew from our online monitoring that the Day of Rage wasn't having much impact here in the UK. We also know from previous conflicts that this is what these people do. Hamas call for it, Hezbollah call for it, Al-Qaeda call for it, ISIS call for it. And generally here in the UK, it's very difficult to see what difference it makes. Because as you've said, we've got hundreds upon hundreds of anti-Semitic incidents have occurred in the course of the last week. Most of them abuse. There's also quite a lot of graffiti. The most common thing is just Jews, including Jewish school kids, having Free Palestine yelled at them from passing cars or by people in the street. We're hearing this all the time. But the language is beginning to harden. You know, what we saw last week, demonstrations on the streets, a mood of jubilation, defiant jubilation that so many Jews had been killed.
What about what the government can actually do to help? I've mentioned that Rishi Sunak has been visiting a school. We'll hear part of what he said in just a moment. But is enough being done, in your view, by the government and other agencies in terms of protecting the Jewish community?
The support of the government is absolutely rock solid. I was at Downing Street last week for a meeting with senior police officers that was introduced by the Prime Minister and was then chaired by the Home Secretary. The lessons that were learned during previous wars in the Middle East are now being applied. The determination of the government and of the police should not be doubted. Similarly, the support that's been expressed by very senior members of the Labour Party. But what I'm hearing in the meetings that I'm doing with the Jewish community is not concerns about the government, it's not concerns about the police, it's concerns about the way that the BBC and Sky cover this conflict, the framing that you put on it, your refusal to call terrorism terrorism, the feeling that if it had happened against anybody else, that that's how you would call it. And if you don't call it that, then the scenes that we're about to see unfold in Gaza are far harder for people to understand why it's occurring.
All right,
Similarly, with the FA as well.
Well, Mark, as you know, we do use the word terrorism and terrorist atrocities. It is attributed in the main to other people saying it, like the government, like the opposition. But I'd like to get your response, Darren and Catherine, to what Mark is saying, that is what the Jewish community is most worried about. The use of language, the use of words like terrorism to describe Hamas and members of Hamas. Do you think that is a critical part of this too?
Well, we've just heard that it is. So it is, yes. And that's why across the political divide, there has been a very clear, united line on this. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Its acts of terror in Israel was terrorism. And that's why Israel has the right to defend itself.
Catherine, in terms of the framing and the way Mark says that is important. The government and Labour are rock solid in their support of what Israel is doing and its response to Hamas.
Yeah, I find myself, I've got family friends who have been affected by terrorist incidents in Israel previously. And whilst I'm not Jewish myself, I find myself almost furious on their behalf. It is not OK to glorify terrorism on the streets. No, the police should arrest you. It is not OK to intimidate Jews just because of who they are in this country, in this great country. No, that's a hard no. And to anybody that's feeling vulnerable, the police have got guidance. Mark mentioned the meeting that the Home Secretary, the police chiefs and the Prime Minister had. You know, they've written to police chiefs across the country with the guidance. Don't stand up for it. Not in my name. Not in this country. No.
All right. Well, let's listen to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, talking at a school earlier in response to questions.
In terms of law, how do you differentiate between people at protests supporting Palestine and people who are supporting Hamas and supporting a terrorist organisation?
We've got a proud history in this country of a peaceful right to protest, but that can't veer into inciting racial hatred or violence or abuse, and that's the bit that we were talking through last week, making sure that the police have all the guidance they need, so that if they saw things that, that were happening that were simply not acceptable, that they will be able to step in and do something about it.
Mark, I don't know if you could hear everything that Rishi Sunak was saying, but it is about the balance between people being allowed to protest in favour of Palestinians and stopping, obviously, support of Hamas, a terrorist organisation prescribed by the government. So have we got the balance right?
I think the balance shifted because of what happened on Saturday and Sunday in Israel. I know that it shifted in terms of the instructions given to the police, the guidance. The Attorney General was in that meeting also. I was in the room, actually, when the audio that you played occurred. And, when the Jewish community holds a demonstration about the Middle East, actually, when we held it last week, it was a vigil. We're holding vigils and we call for peace. That's how we do it. That's what we believe in. We believe in peace. The demonstrations last weekend were jubilation at what had occurred. Now, the mood on the demonstrations will change as what goes on in Gaza and Israel changes in the coming weeks. But nobody on those demonstrations is calling for a peaceful solution. Nobody is calling for a two-state solution. They chant free, free Palestine. They mean everything there. They chant from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. They don't mean a state in which Jews and Muslims and Christians have equal rights. You know what they want because you know what Hamas did at the weekend. There is no longer any doubt. And also, by the way, the whole anti-racist movement here in the UK, the trade union movement, to an extent also the churches as well.
Yep.
Nobody's coming forward with support for the Jewish community at this time. None of them. It's a disgrace.
All right. There obviously has been huge loss of life in the Gaza Strip too. 2,700 Palestinians at least have been killed in the bombing campaign by Israel. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. I want to get a response to what you've said about a mood of jubilation on those protests, because we have Ben Jamal, who's director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who organised those protests in London. Thousands of pro-Palestinian supporters, Ben, took to the streets across the UK. But what do you say to Mark Gardner that it was more a mood of jubilation, of almost celebrating what had happened in Israel by Hamas?
Well, I can... good afternoon, Joe. I can only presume that Mark Gardner was not at the protest on Saturday. The demonstration on Saturday was delivering a number of messages. Protests always have a number of messages. The first message was a message of solidarity to the Palestinian people, letting them know that there are people of conscience in the UK who recognise the oppression under which they have been living for decades, but recognise also urgently the situation they are facing right now in Gaza with the impending threat of either mass ethnic cleansing or mass slaughter. But secondly, protests are there seeking change and seeking a change of policy. And there is deep concern and anger at the response of our political leaders.
Ah.
The response of our political leaders should be grounded in a respect for international law and human rights. That means that political leaders should be saying unanimously that they recognize that international law makes clear that the deliberate killing of civilians, hostage taking, and imposition of collective punishment are war crimes and should be condemned no matter who perpetrates them. What we have seen is a utilization of that framework to condemn the actions by Hamas on October the 7th, but then a complete abandonment of that framework when it comes to the action of Israel. And it's not that our political leaders have simply been silent about Israel's commission of war crimes and declared intention to commit severe war crimes. They have actually declared unequivocal support for whatever actions Israel chooses to take.
All right, but I've got two politicians here. Just before I get their response, because they will want to challenge your assertion there in terms of unequivocal support. But I'll show you images here, or it's one image of two women protesting. They have on their backs images of paragliders. And they're stuck to their backs. The police are actually looking for them because it seems to be a reference to the motorised paragliders used by Hamas to storm into Israel unprovoked to launch that massacre on civilians at a music festival and at various kibbutzim along the Gaza Strip. Would you accept that that is glorifying violence and terrorist acts by Hamas?
Well, I don't know what was in the minds of the people who had that on their back. I wouldn't justify anybody having that on the back. I saw this reported.
But will you condemn it? Would you condemn that?
Can I finish, Joe?
Yeah.
Can I finish? I saw this reported, first of all, in The Independent. The report I saw, first of all, and I've seen the photographs, and it's worth saying this, made clear it wasn't clear whether those people had sellotaped those on their own back or whether they had been sellotaped on. I would say this.
Yeah, all right, very briefly, then I must go to the politicians.
Let's go back to the framework, Joe, of international law. Anybody who glorifies, celebrates, or justifies actions outside the framework of international law, the killing of civilians, the taking of hostages, or the imposition of collective punishment on an entire people should be condemned.
All right, but just to be clear, but just to be clear, no, hang on. I will, but let me just get you to condemn. Let me just get you, or offer you the opportunity. No, Ben, let me just give you the opportunity to condemn images of paragliders on protesters' backs in order to get the balance right between the freedom to protest and glorifying terrorism.
Well, Joe, I don't think I can be any clearer in what I've said. I've just been very, very clear. And it's really important that political leaders and people like myself and those in the media are very clear at the moment in the language that they use. And I have said very clearly there is a framework of international law that should be respected by everybody.
Well, let me put that. Let me put that point.
You did interrupt me.
Yeah, I know.
Please let me finish.
Yes, Joe, but you have said that. Go on.
Joe, will you let me finish the point I'm trying to make? So anybody who's stepping outside of that in their actions or statements they make should be condemned. But what we should also condemn is what I would describe as a normalization at the moment of a dehumanization of Palestinians. And one way that is happening is trying to suggest that those who come out in solidarity with the Palestinian people are inherently supporting terrorism, which suggests that Palestinians themselves are simply committing acts of terrorism. You have shown me, let me finish, photographs of two people in a crowd of 150,000 people. Why have you chosen, Joe, to focus on those images?
Because they're being hunted, because they are being searched for by the police, and they are actually in breach of breaking the law.
We consulted with the police, as we always do, before organising a protest, and the police spoke to us at the end of the protest. They told us that there had been, I think, 7 arrests in a crowd of over 150,000 people. And they actually indicated to us they thought this had been an extremely well-managed protest that was peaceful. And they were very clear about the nature of
All
the
right,
protest.
let me just bring the politicians. Let me just
policing.
bring the politicians in, because let's go back to that framework. The accusation being that actually there isn't enough support from politicians, from our political leaders, in terms of solidarity with Palestinians who are in Gaza and who may be facing, well, a blockade. Certainly, they're already facing that, a blockade of emergency supplies, and the international law must apply there too.
Well, can I just firstly say it should not have taken that long to not be able to condemn what was an obvious case of glorification of terrorist acts. I don't know why that chap find it so difficult to say that he condemned that at his own protest. It's very clearly the case. And he should have said...
Hang on, Ben. Let me...
He kept saying he was clear, but he wasn't. He could have just condemned it in about 3 seconds, and he ought to do that confidently next time he's asked. The question on whether politicians have been equivocal or unequivocal, again, that chap was factually incorrect. Every Labour Party politician, and I'm pretty sure every Conservative politician, has said that interventions must be within international law. We've called for access for humanitarian aid to innocent Palestinian civilians that need it, and we're continuing to support those mechanisms to be opened and available to them. We've always said it is subject to international law. To say that we haven't is just factually incorrect, and he should apologise and correct the record.
Do you want to apologise, Ben?
Can I come back? I'm very sorry. I don't know who it is I'm speaking to.
Oh, yes. So Darren Jones, who's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury of the Labour Party, and Catherine Fletcher, who's a Conservative MP.
I'm not going to respond to his comments about
well, you just said you were going to respond, so please respond to them.
Your viewers can make their own judgments.
Yeah, well, respond to my comments. You just said you were going to. That's why you're back on the TV.
Darren, if you would stop interrupting me,
well,
then
respond to the comments. That's why you're here.
Darren, if you would stop interrupting me, I will be able to
Ben,
speak.
you've had a lot of time to talk, but I haven't got as much time. But you need to answer the questions that are put to you.
Darren, to what you have said. You have said that the Labour Party leadership has been unequivocal in its statements of Israel's responsibilities to respect international law. Keir Starmer went on LBC. He was asked a straightforward question. Is it legitimate for Israel to cut off the supply of food, fuel, water and essential medical supplies to the people of Gaza? He said, yes, Israel was justified in doing that. Let me ask you, Darren.
Please.
UNICEF says that 700 Palestinian children were killed in the first 7 days of Israeli bombing. Do you condemn that? Because that's a violation of international law under anybody's terms. Do you condemn that? And do you condemn...
Well, let him answer those questions.
Israel's instruction to over 1 million people to leave their homes or be responsible for their own deaths. Do you condemn those actions?
All right, I'll let Darren and then Catherine answer that question.
Thank you. Of course, we always condemn the loss of civilian life.
Well, do you want to do it now?
Hang on, Ben, you do need to wait for people to respond. Otherwise, we're just going to have to let you go if we can't have a conversation rather than a one-sided monologue.
I suggest you might want to listen a bit more, Ben, and think more carefully about your own answers before criticising other people. I condemn it. And on your quote of Keir Starmer, I've got the quote here on my phone. You should read the whole paragraph. He says in that paragraph, in his answer on LBC, subject to international law. He said it very clearly. So you must stop going around. No. You must stop going around saying that he didn't say that, because he did. It's a matter of fact. It's on the record, and you should apologise for making that.
Hang on, Ben. No, I'm going, and I will come to Ben. I'm going to let Catherine respond. No, I'm going to let Catherine respond because you put questions to the politicians. So, Catherine, you have a chance to respond.
Ben, you need to get off broadcast and be a little bit on receive. Seriously, this is a very sensitive situation. International law allows people to defend their right from attack. They have unequivocally been attacked. International law also calls for restraint, and I would make absolutely clear that that's exactly what everybody is doing in this international diplomatic effort, supporting Israel's 100% right to defend itself when it's been attacked by terrorists in form of Hamas. Is Hamas the Palestinian people? No. But I have a question, well, two questions for you, Ben. Do you think it's acceptable to use the From the Rivers to the Sea chant, which in effect calls for the removal of Israel, one? And two, who gave you permission to put a stage on the cenotaph, which is recording our war dead and people that have sacrificed themselves for this country? Surely Trafalgar Square or Parliament Square was more appropriate.
On the second point, because we're running... Hang on, Ben, I'm going to get you to respond. Yes, but can you answer the point about what actually does clarify as going beyond rightful protest? That chant that's been referenced by Catherine Fletcher, which is what Hamas calls for, the obliteration of Israel, is that acceptable?
Well, this is quite extraordinary, Joe. So can you allow me to just come back on several points, if possible, without interruption?
But really briefly. I will.
Right. Well, look, first of all, I would invite your viewers, the comments that Keir Starmer made are all over social media.
Right, well, let's not respond. We've heard about that.
He was asked very specifically, and he said that Israel was allowed to take the actions that I've described. It was acceptable for them to cut off essential supplies. In relation to the question about the cenotaph, that was a police decision. We wanted to have the stage outside Downing Street, and the police indicated would prefer that it was further north. So it was set up where the police decided. So if you have a concern about that, Catherine, I suggest you take it up with the Metropolitan Police. Thirdly, let's deal, because this speaks very precisely to the issue I've made, a point I've made about the dehumanization of Palestinians and the normalization of that in political discourse. One primary example of that is the issue of the chant from the river to the sea. And the chant is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And the accusation is that that is a call for a genocide of the Jewish people. That is a grotesque thing to say. What that chant indicates is that the Palestinian people across all of historic Palestine, so whether they are living as citizens inside the state of Israel, under military occupation in Gaza, or under military occupation in the West Bank, are all subject to a system of oppression that has been defined now by international human rights monitoring bodies as a system of apartheid.
All right, we're going to stop it there. I'm going to stop it there because I've got to bring... Hang on, Ben.
When the conditions of violence, when the root causes of violence are addressed, that's what the chant...
All right. I'm afraid that is all we have time for with you. Let me ask our other guests. Sonia, first of all, listening, though, to both what Ben was saying and Mark Gardner, but let's reflect on what Ben is saying. Do you think these protests have crossed the line? What happens to those who just want to show solidarity with Palestinians?
Well, they clearly cross the line in some places, and the people wearing those images of paragliders was one example of that. But I think there's two ways of looking at this. There's what is lawful and unlawful protests, and there I think we've got clear laws. Glorification of a prescribed terrorist organisation is not lawful where that happens. But I want to just take a step back and look at this through a very human lens. So I've got Jewish friends. Of course, people have the right to go out and protest against Israel's bombing of Gaza. They do. We live in a liberal democracy. But for my Jewish friends, I guess, they look at the comparison between the extent to which there were public shows of solidarity in the wake of what I think are the worst terrorist attacks we've seen for decades. The contrast between that and then the protests on Saturday. And on a very human level, I really understand why my Jewish friends see the difference. They see that there is a question of Israel's response, a legitimate democratic debate to be had around that. And then there are the terrorist atrocities that occurred that we should all, in our shared humanity, unequivocally condemn and show solidarity with Jewish people over the Israeli people. And there have been differences. Mark is right to point out that the FA Arch gets lit up in commemoration of victims of terrorism in other countries, but it was not done in commemoration of the victims of this terrorist attack. So I really understand why my Jewish friends look at what's happened this weekend and they feel scared and they feel worried. And I want to express my solidarity with them.
Matt, I mean, the dehumanisation, or he said the normalisation of dehumanisation of Palestinians. This is what Ben has been talking about. That's what he worries about here. Do you think that he, in support of Palestinians and a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, is something that gets lost in what is a very heated and difficult debate?
I thought that interview was outrageous. I thought it was ridiculous. I think the fact that he was given so much time relative to a representative of Britain's Jewish communities
I think they were both
was outrageous. And he was given considerably more time than the Community Security Trust. And this is exactly why British Jews are feeling so badly treated. And I can't remember a time in my life when I felt more ashamed by our national debate and our country as I have over the last week. I've tried to imagine how I would feel if I was a British Jew. We have a national broadcaster, the BBC, unable to call a Nazi-inspired, ISIS-inspired terrorist group terrorists. We have the same broadcaster investigating BBC Arabic journalists for expressing sympathy for Hamas. We have the institutions of our national community like Wembley Stadium showing the rainbow flag to protest against Qatar, but not showing the colours of Israel in solidarity. And we have the universities where I work, a few years ago, fell over themselves to express solidarity with George Floyd and what happened centuries ago in America, but are unable to issue the same condemnation of what's happened in Israel. Not to mention the fact we've now got schools telling Jewish children in Britain in 2023 not to show symbols of their faith, and we've got fireworks and celebrations going on Edgware Road, and we've got idiots like that guy excusing the glorification of terrorism.
Well, hang on.
Joe, I was at the protest. I was at the protest, and there's one thing he didn't mention, which were the groups of men running around physically attacking people, showing the Israel flag. There was glorification of terrorism at that protest. Those people should be treated the same way as supporters of ISIS.
And that is why we're discussing it. But there is a line, isn't there, Matt Goodwin? I mean, do pro-Palestinian voices have a right to take to the streets and protest? And the vast majority of them, according to someone obviously you don't have any regard for, and that's absolutely fine, Ben Jamal, but the majority of them were protesting in solidarity of Palestinians who are facing blockades, rightly or wrongly, but they are facing blockades. Thousands have lost their lives. Do they not have the right to protest in Britain?
Of course they have the right to protest in Britain, but how many cases of the glorification of terrorism and Hamas have we seen? And to be frank, I actually think, Joe,
it's against the law, and the police will deal with it.
I think this country has lost its moral compass. Well, I don't think we no longer understand the importance of taking a position on issues which are very clear-cut in the minds of ordinary people. A few days ago, the Brits were asked, do you think Hamas is a terrorist organisation or not? 2/3 of the country said, yes, absolutely. So why can the BBC not refer to Hamas as a terrorist organisation when it also you're more than happy to take on the language of gender ideology. You're more than happy to insist on pronouns. You're more than happy to use language when it fits the agenda. But many British Jews are looking at this national debate and feeling rightly that they are not treated with the same degree of respect as other minority communities.
And that is a very legitimate view expressed by you and others. But the point, actually, just finally, because I want to do something on prisons before the end of the programme, but just finally, do you think Britain has lost its moral compass for the reasons that Matt Goodwin says?
No, I don't. And I think we're kind of at risk of going into another kind of culture war-based debate, which is a whole other topic for another day. All I would say is that in Bristol, in my home city this weekend, there were entirely peaceful vigils and demonstrations for people who had concern for innocent civilians in Palestine, as well as for what's happening in Israel. There was one small incident and the police dealt with it very, very quickly. That's the way it should be done.
Catherine?
I really want a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. You know, my heart is going out to both sides, and whatever we can do to make sure that this doesn't prevent that longer-term peace, which is in everybody's interest in the region, as well as then the communities that, you know, call the UK home and are British citizens. I think, you know, that's ultimately what we as country's leaders have got to work for.
Let's talk about prisons. Severe overcrowding, which won't come as a surprise in the UK's prisons. In England and Wales, the total capacity is nearly 89,000, while the current prison population is over 88,000. That means prisons are about 500 or so places away from being completely full. Later today, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, will make a statement in the House of Commons addressing the crisis. Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Mail. Low-level offenders will clean up graffiti and plant trees instead of being sent to prison as ministers try to solve major overcrowding crisis that has seen judges told to delay putting rapists behind bars. Catherine, how have we got to this point?
OK, so the last bit's just not true. You know, Alex Chalk was, you know, has denied. There's no, in fact, actually, we're putting the most violent criminals away for longer. You know, we're cancelling the automatic release after half of their sentence. In terms of, there's two things with offenders that have jail terms for under 12 months. One of which is the data shows that they're much more likely to reoffend. So is it really working? Because our job is to keep the country and our community safe. But two, you know, there's big changes in technology since we first did this. You know, the tags are much more sophisticated. And
so is overcrowding not a problem when we're almost at capacity, according to the figures?
There is an issue, you know. So there's two.
But what I'm saying is, how have we got to the point of almost reaching capacity?
Because what we're doing is making sure that people feel safe in their communities. But I think that there is... hang on. I think there's an area where actually we've overlooked it, which is it a good idea to have people on the spin cycle going in on short-term 12-month sentences? And I think when statement today, I think there are different things. I've seen the work gangs come into Leyland, you know, the prisoners paying their debt to community with, you know, regular clocking in, clocking out time, physical hard work, you know, contributing to the community, being proud. You should see the paths in Word and Park. They've done an amazing job.
But the problem is there is messaging here that is in contrast to what you're saying, because we've got here in the Times, build prisons to fit shoplifters, Minister suggests. And that's because prolific offenders face jail time under new law despite overcrowding. Which is it? Are we going to give some offenders the chance to have community orders, or are you wanting to put more people in prison for things like shoplifting?
Well, I think the answer is both. So there's one of these where it's not a black and white debate. No, because if you're a serial offender, that's not the same as you know, somebody that could benefit from a community prison order. I mean, the detail needs to be worked through. I'm looking forward to Alex's statement, but the idea that we have to be completely black and white with this debate, I don't think that's right.
Darren?
There are two separate issues here. One is sentencing guidelines, who should go to prison for what offence, and the other issue is, do we have enough prison places? On prison places, we do not have enough prison places. The budget is £4 billion, only £1.3 billion of it has been spent so far. Why has the government not been using its existing budgets to build more prison places when there's money there ready to be spent?
They have.
1.3 billion of a £4 billion budget. Are you saying there's now not a problem and another 2.7 billion is available?
In HMP Garth and Wymont, we've got some of the rapid deployment cells.
Come on, I mean, there's a problem.
I do think it's a massive failure of politics, though, that it's taken prisons being at capacity to get to the point where we're talking about scrapping short sentences. Scrapping short sentences is a no-brainer. They don't work, they make people more likely to reoffend, and they disrupt people's lives who've committed minor crimes, who deserve punishment, but short prison sentence of under a year is not it. We've had 3 Conservative Justice Secretaries say they're going to scrap them. Ken Clarke in 2010, David Gauke in 2019, and it didn't happen. And I think it's sad that it has to take a crisis in prisons to get politicians to do something that is absolutely right because they're scared of looking soft on crime.
Matt?
Yeah, I think many voters will be surprised at why this wasn't seen earlier. I mean, we've had 13 years of Conservative governments. The other stat that struck me reading the papers this morning was that the government's going to try and ease or create new spaces by deporting some of the 10,000 foreign nationals who have committed criminals.
And actually British prisoners face serving time abroad.
Which raises the obvious question of, well, why wasn't that done sooner?
But why wasn't that done sooner, Catherine? I mean, what is the problem with deporting foreign prisoners?
Do you know what? I think Alex Chalk would chop both my hands up if I tried to speculate on the details of his brief when I don't know.
But this is where I think lots of voters are sat at home. Also about the shoplifting issue, Joe, I sit in focus groups with voters all the time. What they feel is that we're sort of allowing low-level crime and a sort of breakdown of civility in Britain to just be accepted. You know, if you talk to shops, I was at a conference recently where shopkeepers were explaining how much money they're losing to shoplifting, and it is mind-boggling.
But you're not suggesting that people should tackle the offenders with
what I'm saying is the perception out there in the country is that crime is generally proliferating. Low-level crime.
No, I agree with you. You're right.
That is one of the outcomes of a reduction in policing numbers. You start to see a low-level breakdown in the rule of law, and that is not acceptable. Loads of people will say, you know, something happens to them, they try and report a crime. Actually, it's very difficult to get the police interested in things like minor property theft.
But I think
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm sorry, that's all we have time for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Join me then. Bye-bye.